In the vast Siberian steppes, where the land seemed to stretch to the end of the world, a veil of silence pressed down on the Mongol patrol. The sharp winds, like sharp blades, howled through the twisted trees, while the snow fell almost hypnotically, covering everything with a cold white blanket. The sky, eternally gray, seemed to swallow the horizon, and the men, hardened by life of war, felt their bodies and spirits weakening under the weight of the journey. Despair crept in like a silent disease, and with each step into the icy expanse, they felt the presence of something greater, something they could not see, but that was there, waiting. Each night, the soldiers' tired eyes turned to the dark forests around them, where the sound of the wind became almost human, a distant lament, full of sadness and omens of death. The routine of the patrol was relentless. During the day, the marshes were endless, the footsteps heavy in the soft and treacherous snow, which seemed to swallow up sound and hope itself. Provisions were scarce, and the Mongols, men accustomed to the harshness of battle, now found themselves facing an immense enemy, the wild and merciless nature. Food was scarce, and the few resources they had were quickly consumed. The nights, long and cold, became a psychological test as great as physical. The campfires, small and flickering, failed to provide true warmth, and the warmth that had once existed in the warriors' bodies was now a distant memory. Fear of the unknown began to take over their minds, and what had previously been mere superstition transformed into a threatening and palpable presence. The Mongol patrol, accustomed to facing enemy armies and barbarian tribes, now found themselves lost in a territory where the greatest enemy was their own collective fear. There was something about Siberia that broke even the hardest soldiers. The local legends of vengeful spirits and abyssal monsters didn't seem so distant now. Shamanism, a belief that had until then been relegated to campfire stories, was becoming a terrifying reality. The men eyed each other suspiciously, their eyes glazed with growing paranoia, while whispers of the disappearances of previous rangers began to take shape. Where were the others? Some said they had been taken by wolves, but not ordinary wolves. Others spoke of the wailing of the winds, an ancient evil that claimed the souls of the unwary. But no one dared to actually speak out loud, for they feared what it might bring back. With each step deeper into the forest, the fear grew stronger, more palpable. The patrol was not only facing the unexplored vastness of Siberia, but the weight of their own inner beliefs and fears. The Mongol Empire, an invincible force in the known lands, was now at the mercy of an invisible force, something that neither their military strategies nor their combat tactics could defeat. The soldiers, fearless in battle, were being defeated by the land itself, and the supernatural seemed to be getting closer and closer. Every noise in the forest, every sigh of the wind, began to carry the weight of ancient fear, and the most experienced warriors began to doubt. Were they hunters or prey in a territory they did not understand? What had previously seemed like a simple patrol mission now turned into a desperate fight for survival, where the greatest enemy was not man, but the unknown. The murmurs of the supernatural were no longer just legends. They were becoming a terrifying reality that consumed the mind and soul of each man on the patrol. The fear of being devoured by the icy forest, of getting lost among the trees and the wind, was a constant shadow. And the worst part? They did not know whether the real threat was coming from within or without their ranks. It was a morning like any other, cold and silent when the event occurred. The Mongol patrol was on the march, making its way through the frozen Siberian forest. The sound of their boots crunching on the snow, the only noise to break the deathly stillness of the surroundings. The leader, a ruthless veteran named Ogle, was scanning the cloudy horizon as if trying to find some sign of change in the vast unexplored lands. The biting wind seemed to whisper secrets he did not want to hear. He knew something was wrong. He could feel it in his skin. The air was thicker, heavier, and even the sound of the wind seemed different, as if nature itself was preparing for something great. Then, without warning, one of the soldiers in the rearguard, a young man named Tumman, disappeared. He had been there seconds before, helping to rearrange the supplies, but when he turned to tell Ogle something, he was simply gone. There were no shouts, no noise. The forest was undisturbed, the snow untouched. The other members of the patrol stopped, looking around in bewilderment. The sight of Tumman, with his black hair and curious gaze, was already far away. Disorientation took hold of the men, and the silence was broken only by the sound of the wind that seemed to whisper even louder. Ogle immediately ordered the patrol to split into groups to search, but as they searched the area, they found nothing. There were no footprints, no tracks in the snow, nothing to indicate that anyone could have gotten lost there. The forest, immense and impenetrable, swallowed up every trace. Tumman's disappearance was not only inexplicable, it was impossible. They had marched for miles, and the path was simple, direct, with no natural obstacles that could have caused the disappearance of a man so close to the group. And then, as if it were a sign that something more was about to happen, Ogle received a message he had never expected, a written order coming directly from Karakoram, the capital of the Mongol Empire. But the strangest thing was not the order itself, but its content. The paper, cold to the touch, was covered in symbols that Ogle did not recognize. They were like runes, strange and ancient, that had never been seen in any official document of the empire. The words were enigmatic, and the tone of the message indicated a request for immediate return to the capital. But something in its lines suggested that the patrol should be disbanded. There was no justification, only the urgency to head to a specific place in the forest, a spot marked with an unusual symbol, one that no one had ever heard of. Ogle looked at the paper, and a shiver ran down his spine. It made no sense. The Mongol Empire had never sent orders without clear explanations. But the message was there, in his hands, and the fate of his patrol now hung in the balance of something greater, something he could not understand. Without warning, Tumman had disappeared, and now a mysterious order stood before him, defying everything he knew about his duty and his empire. Fear began to spread among the soldiers, and the murmur of ancient legends grew louder in the conversations around the campfires. Some said that Tumman had been taken by forces beyond human comprehension, while others believed that the order was related to something much more sinister. The forest around them seemed even darker now, and the sound of the wind was like a promise of something that was about to happen. Ogle sensed that something was approaching, something that was not human, something that could not be defeated. The patrol was about to be drawn into an enigma that not even the greatest of Mongol generals could comprehend. The patrol's fate was sealed, and the journey that seemed to be just another reconnaissance mission would turn into a nightmare, where the greatest enemy would not be man, but the deep mystery of Siberia. Ogle stared at the paper with the mysterious order in his hands, but the feeling of unease that spread through his chest would not go away. The entire patrol was silent, the only sound coming from the rustling of the wind and the crackling of the fires trying to fight against the relentless cold. He felt the weight of responsibility, but what bothered him most was the growing feeling that this mission was wrong, that something was very wrong. The Empire had never given orders like that. They were alone in a land where not even the gods seemed to dare to tread. The men's eyes were fixed on him, and he could feel the fear and doubt beginning to seep in. With a sigh, Ogle pushed the message away from everyone's view and approached the soldiers who were crouched around the fire, trying to warm their hands stiffened by the freezing night. There was an unspoken anxiety in each man's eyes, and the tension in the air was palpable. "We can't follow this order, Ogle. Something isn't right," GB, one of the more veteran soldiers, said, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering light of the fire. He had always been the most skeptical of the group, but now his tone was thick with unease. Whatever happened to Tumen, it wasn't human, it wasn't an accident, and now this, an order from Karakoram that no one understands. We can't follow it without question, we can't. Ogle bit his lip, fighting back a rising sense of panic. He knew the bravery of his men well, but something was happening here. Something that defied all natural laws. He looked at the faces around him, seeing the fear in them, masked by an attempt to appear unfazed. But the order is clear, Ogle replied, his voice firmer than he felt. Return to the capital? The mission cannot be ignored. They demand that we proceed to the appointed point, with or without explanation. But what about Tumen? Asked Badr, a young soldier with wide eyes, his voice shaking. What happened to him? Didn't he disappear as if swallowed by the earth? I'm not superstitious, but everyone knows what they say about these forests. They talk about the wailing of the winds. They talk about spirits that take men, dragging them to places no one else can find. Could it be that we are entering the territory of something? Something that not even the gods can face? Ogle clenched his fists. He had heard the same stories when he was younger, tales whispered by old warriors and shamans in their tents during the long nights. But now those legends seemed to materialize in a terrifying way. The doubt he felt was the same one that was beginning to creep into the hearts of his men. Yet he knew he had to hold the line. He had to be the leader, even if his own fear was eating away at him from within. We cannot give in to fear, he said, trying to sound more confident than he actually was. If we follow the legends, we will end up paralyzed. Remember who we are. We are Mongols. Our empire rules more land than any other. We do not run away. There was a heavy silence after his words. A few of the men exchanged furtive glances, and the tension grew even more, as if the air itself were charged with electricity. Ogle could feel the soldiers' faces no longer as certain as they had been. He knew that the spirits of this land had the power to weaken even the bravest, and the uncertainty was beginning to erode the trust he had in the group. But what if this is not just fear? Jeeb said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, but the words were like stones thrown into the stillness of the river. What if Tumen and all the others who disappeared were not taken by something we cannot see? Something beyond our reach, beyond our understanding. We are not immune to what is beyond our control. Jeeb's words hung in the air, and Ogle felt a chill run down his spine. He knew what was being suggested. It was not just fear of the unknown. It was fear of the supernatural, of the idea that they were being pulled toward a destiny they could not understand, something that ordinary men could not face. So what do you suggest? Ogle asked, trying to maintain his composure. But deep inside, he could already feel that the decision was becoming more difficult than he had imagined. Should we ignore Karakoram's order? Turn back and face the shame of having failed our mission? What if this is a test? The Empire may not forgive us. We need to understand what is happening, Badr said firmly. We must unravel this mystery, not as Mongols who blindly follow orders, but as men who know true battle. Ogle closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to feel the weight of his words. He was ready to challenge any army, any enemy, but this mission was changing something inside him. The unknown was like an abyss that he did not know if he could face. And the biggest doubt of all was not whether he would be able to fulfill his mission, but whether he would be able to survive it. The forest with its strange sounds and whispering winds seemed to look at him with an empty and indifferent gaze, as if it knew that none of his men would be the same after what was to come. When the patrol finally decided to camp at dusk, the tension had already reached its peak. Ogle, after hours of deliberation with his men, knew that the decision to follow the order or not could not be postponed any longer. As the flames of the campfires cast long shadows across the trees, a stranger appeared at the edge of the camp. He was an old man, bent over by the weight of many winters gone by. His hair, white as the snow that covered the ground, was tied in braids that fell to his waist. He wore a bearskin cloak, his feet bare, defying the cold with a confidence that seemed unearthly. His eyes, a deep gray, reflected the light of the flames in an unsettling way, as if they held secrets from times long past. He did not seem to mind the presence of the soldiers, and the patrol watched him silently, as if they knew, somehow, that he had come here for a reason. Ogle, who had seen many things throughout his career, but nothing that compared to this feeling, approached cautiously. The old man did not seem to be in a hurry, as if time were irrelevant to him. When he was close enough, the man turned and looked at him with a look that seemed to penetrate his soul. Asterisk, I saw you coming, the old man said, his voice hoarse but firm. And I saw the fear in your eyes. There is no shame in fearing what you cannot understand, but there is wisdom in listening to it. Ogle frowned, trying to decipher what the words meant. Who are you? He asked, trying to maintain his composure, but feeling that something much deeper was being suggested. The name they gave me no longer matters, the old man replied with an enigmatic smile. I am but an echo of those who came before us. What matters is what you are about to face. The forest, the wind, and the ancient spirits. They are not something you can defeat with steel and fire, but you can try to understand. The surrounding soldiers began to murmur uneasily. Some, especially the younger ones, felt their unease growing as the old man's words intertwined with the legends that had been passed down for generations. The wind here is not just wind, the old man continued, looking up at the gray sky, where the clouds were gathering as if they were about to swallow the world. It carries the voices of those who have lost their way, those who have crossed the threshold and have not been able to return. It calls to you, to all who follow it. And when it calls, you must not follow. Do not do this. Ogle, who had always trusted in his courage and rationality, felt a chill run through his body. He had faced enemies, battles, and even death in other forms, but this talk of winds and spirits seemed beyond anything he could face. Still, he stood firm. These are just stories to frighten the weak, Ogle said, more to himself than to the old man. The Empire does not send us here to succumb to ghosts. The old man did not flinch. He looked directly into Ogle's eyes, as if searching for something there. Do you truly believe the Empire can save you from here? It is not the Empire that rules these lands. The Empire is a castle of clay, its walls crumbling at the first gust of wind that blows from an ancient land. Siberia bows to no man, and she cares nothing for her empire. No army can conquer the soul of a land like this. Ogle felt the weight of those words in his chest, but he would not give in to fear. So what do you suggest? That we turn and face our shame? What should we do then? The old man looked at the group, his smile more foreboding than comforting. There is a trail hidden in the shadows of the forest. It is not visible to the common eye, but those who know how to follow the signs can find it. Once you cross it, the journey will change. There will be no turning back. The tension grew. The patrol was divided, but something in the man's words, in the gravity of his voice, gave the soldiers pause. They felt that whatever it was beyond the control of any military command. You must go to the designated point, but not alone. Take with you the men who still believe in your strength. But remember, true strength is knowing when to retreat, the old man said, now with a seriousness that made even the wind stop for a moment. And when you reach that place, remember, do not follow the wind. Do not follow the pain. They are as hungry as you are. That last sentence echoed in the silence of the night, deeper than any shout or order. Ogle felt the weight of responsibility, but also the feeling that something was closing in on them, something inevitable. Before he walked away, the old man made a farewell gesture, and his final words hung in the air. Be quick. If the wind calls, do not answer. It never releases those who follow it. Ogle stood still for a moment, trying to understand the meaning behind the words. He wanted to defy the old man, to dispel the thoughts of superstition, but a part of him knew that this warning was no mere fantasy. Something was about to happen, something far greater than they could imagine. And he wasn't sure he was ready to face it. Looking at the dense forest ahead, Ogle felt the weight of the unknown on his chest, as if the earth itself were waiting to swallow the patrol. The trees, tall and ancient, stood like silent sentinels, their thick, twisted trunks like the arms of petrified giants. The wind, which had hitherto whistled across the open steppes, was now stifled by the density of the vegetation. There was an eerie stillness in the air, as if the world around them was breathing hard, afraid to break the silence. The sound of their boots on the snow seemed muffled, as if the earth itself were swallowing their footsteps, making each movement heavier, more difficult. Ogle took a deep breath, trying to control the fear that was taking root in his mind. The legends of this forest were not just stories to scare young soldiers. Those who ventured here, according to the elders, never returned, or if they did, they were never the same. The land seemed to have a memory of its own, as if it absorbed the souls of those who dared to cross it, leaving them to wander like lost shadows. "We are entering the heart of Siberia," Jeeb murmured, his voice thick with attention Ogle had not heard before. "This is the place of legends, not just of winds but of spirits. Those who get lost here do not return, Ogle. I do not want to be next." The forest around him seemed to absorb his words, as if it did not care what they were saying. The air was thick with a sharp, acrid smell, as if the earth had been rotting for centuries. There was a mixture of damp moss, rotting wood, and something else, something indefinable that made Ogle's throat tighten. The sun barely penetrated the thick blanket of branches and leaves, leaving the forest in a constant gloom, as if the light were an intruder. As the men advanced, the atmosphere became increasingly oppressive. The sound of the wind, which had once been heard across the steppes, was now almost absent, as if drowned out by the vast presence of the forest. The only sound that remained was the rustle of dry leaves beneath the soldiers' feet, the crackle of the trees, and every now and then the snap of branches breaking. But there was something else, something subtle but unmistakable. A low murmur, as if distant voices were speaking in a language no one understood. They were not human voices, but something that echoed deep within the forest, as if the trees, the earth itself, were trying to communicate or warn. Ogle paused for a moment and looked back. The sight of the patrol disappearing into the shadows of the forest, the soldiers hesitantly following, made him feel more alone. They were leaving behind what they knew, and what lay ahead was a vast, impenetrable darkness. It was then that he heard a sound that stopped his mind for a moment. A low, steady sound, like a sigh, coming from deep within the forest. It wasn't the wind. It was more like a moan, a muffled groan that seemed to drag through the earth. Ogle looked around, but saw nothing but dark trunks and fallen leaves. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling that something was watching them, something lurking in the shadows, grew stronger. "We're being watched," Badr said in a whisper, as if the words could summon the presence that lurked in the shadows. He looked up at the trees with apprehension. I feel it. Something isn't right here." The other men began to move more slowly, the tension building, like a rope about to snap. With each step, the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot seemed louder, more invasive, as if the forest were closing in. The trees seemed to close in on them, their branches reaching out like claws, trying to touch them, to grab them. The darkness that had once seemed a natural part of the environment now seemed like a separate entity, as if it were alive, pulsing, waiting for the right moment to swallow each of them. And then, as if confirming his worst fears, Ogle saw something moving in the shadows. A figure, quick and fleeting, slipping between the trees, so fast that he barely had time to process it. Something human, but not. It was just a blur, A shadow that disappeared before he could make a move. Did we see something or someone? Jeeb asked, his voice trembling, once again breaking the heavy silence. We don't know, Ogle replied, his voice steady but his body twitching involuntarily. But whatever it is, we're inside what we're looking for. And now we can't go back. The patrol followed, wordless, their steps slower and more careful. The forest was closing in on them, the feeling of claustrophobia growing. The air seemed thicker now, laden with a heaviness that made each man's lungs feel heavier. The smell of rot and damp enveloped everything, and the sound of distant voices, or were they screams, continued, more insistent, closer. Something was waiting for them in the darkness of the forest, and Ogle knew, with a certainty that haunted him, that no shadow, no wind, and no legend was as threatening as what they were about to encounter. Asterisk, asterisk. The days dragged on as the patrol made its way through the forest, each step heavier than the last. The air was filled with a suffocating sensation, as if something invisible were squeezing each man's throat. The trees, tall and distorted, seemed to close in closer with each passing hour, creating shadowy corridors where daylight barely penetrated. The feeling of being watched had never gone away, but now as time passed, it had morphed into something more. The tension wasn't just coming from some visible enemy. No, it was the sensation that the shadows themselves were moving, that the space around them was somehow distorting, as if the forest had a will of its own. And that, more than any sound or apparition, was the most terrifying of all. The first night deep in the forest was marked by a strange occurrence. Butter, who had always been more sensitive to local legends, said he had heard whispers coming from the darkness. At first, everyone thought it was just the wind, but then he insisted, his eyes wide and his voice shaking. They're talking, he murmured. I heard them. They're saying my name. Ogle tried to ignore it, but he couldn't help but notice how uncomfortable the others seemed. Even Jeeb, who had always defied superstition, was uneasy. As the patrol progressed, small things began to happen. Sometimes, in the midst of the deep silence, one of the men would find strange objects in his path, a broken amulet made of bones, lying in the snow. Other times, a tree seemed to have moved from its place, its roots springing almost impossibly, or twisted branches blocking the path, as if someone or something were guiding them in a specific direction. And worst of all, these changes, these distortions, were always too slight to be picked up on directly, but clear enough to be disturbing. Something was manipulating the space around them, creating a field of insecurity, a paranoia that infiltrated the mind of each soldier. At one point, as the group made their way through a clearing shrouded in thick fog, one of the soldiers, a man named Togrul, simply vanished. They were in formation, following their leader, when he let out a muffled scream. Ogle turned quickly, but when he reached the place where Togrul had been, there was nothing. No marks in the snow, no sign of a struggle, nothing. It was as if he had evaporated before their eyes. Fear quickly spread. There was no logical explanation anymore. They had marched into a territory where natural rules seemed to have lost their meaning. That's not possible, Jeeb said, his hands shaking as he gripped the blade. He was here, we were just a few steps away. But Ogle was at a loss for words. He felt a growing pressure in his chest, a sense that something invisible was surrounding them. He had fought dozens of battles, but nothing had prepared him for the void that now formed around them. They were not just in a forest, they were in a place where even reality seemed to be distorted. Over the next few days, the paranoia only grew. The fear no longer came just from the trees or the shadows. It was a constant feeling that something was wrong among the members of the patrol themselves. During the night, Ogle would wake with a start, feeling as if he were being watched. With every sigh of the wind, he felt the pressure of invisible eyes watching his movements, ready to deliver the final blow. The group began to split up. Jeeb and Badr began to argue openly about turning back. "Whatever follows us, we can't go on like this anymore. We're not soldiers anymore. We're prey," Badr said one night, as the snow fell silently around them. Ogle tried to remain calm, insisting that the mission was not yet complete. But deep inside him, a growing doubt began to take shape. He no longer knew if they were pursuing a goal or if they were being led into a trap that no one could escape. One morning, as they made their way through a narrow path through the trees, something even stranger happened. A man who had ventured a little ahead saw the reflection of a figure in a pool of frozen water. He swore he saw a woman, a skeletal figure dressed in animal skins, who seemed to be looking directly at him. Before he could call out to the others, the figure disappeared, sinking into the water like a shadow. "That wasn't human," Jeeb said, his eyes fixed on the spot where the figure had been. "I don't know what it was, but it wasn't human." But the most disturbing thing was when, at night, one of the soldiers had a vision. He didn't know if he was awake or dreaming, but he claimed to have seen a shadow moving among the trees, its eyes glowing in the darkness. "They're watching. US, they know we're here. They know our names. They're waiting." These words spread quickly through the group, and distrust grew like a disease. At one point, the men began to doubt each other. Were the other men true companions, or just another illusion created by the forest? The wind, which had previously been just a background sound, now became more menacing, as if it were transmitting secret messages, words they couldn't understand but which seemed alone to weaken their will to resist. And as the patrol progressed, the members of the group themselves seemed to be disintegrating. They began to disappear from each other, physically and psychologically. Furtive glances and unspoken words flitted between them, and distrust seemed to be on every face. Who was real? Who was being manipulated? Who was being taken over by the forest? And in the end, Ogle knew it no longer mattered. They were too far gone now, too deeply involved in this place to escape. Whatever it was that was watching them, they had become part of something larger, something they could neither comprehend nor control. They had crossed the threshold of sanity and were losing touch with reality as the forest continued to swallow their every step, their every thought, their every soul. After days in an endless void of twisted trees and thick snow, the patrol finally reached a place none of them could have imagined, a point where the air felt heavier, thicker, as if the environment itself were breathing. The ground, covered in moss and ice, began to become uneven, and the vegetation thinned, giving way to huge black boulders that rose from the earth like exposed bones, remnants of an ancient time. The once clear path was now obscured by rocks, and the trees that surrounded them had parted, as if they had given way to something much larger, something that was not meant to be encountered. As they approached, the forest gave way to a natural formation of rocks that seemed to have been carved by time itself. A great stone arch, carved with enigmatic symbols and worn with age, loomed before them like a gateway to a forgotten world. The entrance was so large that it seemed to swallow the light, and a thick shadow stretched around it, swallowing the landscape and creating a space that daylight barely dared to touch. Ogle stopped, his eyes fixed on the opening, as an icy sensation spread through his bones. It was a feeling that could not be explained, a combination of fear and fascination, as if something dark was waiting for them inside. He felt that they were on the brink of something vast and unknown, something that could change everything. And he did not know if he was ready to face it. This is what we wanted to find?" Badr asked, his voice low, as if he feared the surrounding stones would hear them. His hand shook slightly, but he kept it steady on his sword. The other men were equally silent, their faces tinted by the dim light that filtered through the entrance, their eyes reflecting the same uncertainty and fear. Jeeb, the veteran, was the first to step forward. He touched the dark stone that formed the archway and jerked his hand away as if he had been burned. "These markings," he said, his voice shaking, pointing to the symbols carved into the stones. "These symbols are ancient. I have seen something similar in some of the forbidden texts of Karakoram. They speak of a prison for something that should not be released." Ogle stepped closer, his eyes tracing the inscriptions on the stone. They seemed to ripple with the remaining light, as if they were alive, changing as he looked. They were intricate lines, geometric shapes that intertwined and intersected, but there was something more to the shadows that formed around them, as if the very air itself was distorted by their presence. He felt a growing weight in his throat, an invisible pressure, as if each symbol was charged with an unseen force that watched them. The prison, for what? Jeeb asked, the suspicion in his voice mixed with an almost reverent fear. "I don't know," Ogle replied, though, feeling that the answer was right there, just waiting to be revealed. He didn't want to believe what was beginning to form in his mind, but he knew it was too late to turn back now. Asterisk around the entrance were scattered artifacts, objects that seemed out of place or time-bone masks, polished stone amulets, broken pottery, all covered in a thin layer of frost. Each item had a dark aura, a sense of being used in ancient rituals, of a forgotten cult. Some of the soldiers looked uneasily, as if touching them would mark them in some way, as if the things inside had a will of their own, a power of possession. Looking at the entrance, Ogle had known they were on the brink of something irreversible, something that could not be undone, could not be prevented. The atmosphere was charged, like the air before a storm, and he could feel the shadows closing in, enveloping them. "Whatever it is waiting for us," Ogle said, his voice steady now, despite the fear that was beginning to creep into his gut. "We will enter, now or never." The group moved forward, one hesitant step at a time, until the cave entrance swallowed them whole. The darkness inside was impenetrable, the air heavy and cold, as if they were entering the heart of something ancient, something that had been forgotten by time. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the stone walls, but was soon muffled, as if the space itself was trying to swallow the sounds of their presence. There was no longer any sign of life, no wind, no distant sound of animals. There was only absolute silence, which seemed to weigh down on them like an invisible pressure dot as they advanced. A faint light began to shine, weak and flickering, coming from somewhere ahead. As the patrol approached, the light grew brighter, revealing an immense underground hall. The walls were covered in inscriptions similar to those at the entrance, and in the center of the room stood a massive stone altar. All around him were figures carved in stone, figures that looked human, but with distorted, tortured faces, as if they were in some kind of eternal agony. The feeling of claustrophobia and terror grew with each step, but the worst was yet to come. In the center of the altar, one inscription stood out more clearly than the others, a mark that seemed to glow with a light of its own, a symbol that Ogle did not recognize, but that was somehow familiar to him. He looked at the others, doubt and fear in their eyes. Something was wrong. Something was about to awaken. "They knew we shouldn't come," GB whispered, his voice filled with terror. We unleashed something that should have remained dormant." Ogle felt a cold chill run down his spine as he stared at the symbol that glowed before him, a sense of inevitability taking over his being. They had crossed the line. They had encountered what they should not have. And now there was no turning back. ChatGPT said. The sound of the stone moving was the first sign. A low, growing noise as if the earth were splitting open. The altar in the center of the cavern shook, and the glow of the symbol intensified, pulsing with ever brighter light. The air grew thick, almost heavy, and a cold wind began to blow from within the walls, though there was no opening. "This is not right," Badr shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Before Ogle could react, a dark shadow rose from the center of the altar. It was not a creature, not a man. It was a being of pure darkness, its form undefined, stretching and twisting, as if made of smoke and nightmares. Its eyes glowed like fire, piercing the spirit of each one there. Ogle felt his body paralyzed, his blood frozen. He could not breathe. "Run!" Jeeb screamed, but his voice sounded distant, as if time were stretching, as if space itself were bending around them. The being moved with impossible speed, a wave of energy that tore through the hall. Ogle barely had time to dodge as a shadowy arm reached out and grabbed one of the soldiers, pulling him into the darkness. The scream was muffled, as if swallowed by an invisible mouth. "What is this? What is this?" Badr screamed, his face contorted in horror. He drew his sword, but it seemed useless against what surrounded them. Ogle did not know what to do. He looked at the others, their faces distorted with fear. The cave seemed alive, as if it were closing in on them. The ground collapsed in front of him. A hole appeared without warning, and the stones began to give way, crumbling beneath his feet. "Run now!" Ogle screamed, his voice hoarse, filled with desperation. He didn't know if they could make it, but he had to try. The group scattered, running in opposite directions, but the being followed them, its shadowy hands reaching out toward anyone who came near. Each of the soldiers was pulled into the void, disappearing into the darkness with a muffled scream. Around the entrance were scattered artifacts, objects that seemed out of place, or time-bone masks, polished stone amulets, broken pottery, all covered in a thin layer of frost. Each item had a dark aura, a sense of being used in ancient rituals, of a forgotten cult. Some of the soldiers looked uneasily, as if touching them would mark them in some way, as if the things inside had a will of their own, a power of possession. Looking at the entrance, Ogle had known they were on the brink of something irreversible, something that could not be undone, could not be prevented. The atmosphere was charged, like the air before a storm, and he could feel the shadows closing in, enveloping them. "Whatever it is waiting for us," Ogle said, his voice steady now, despite the fear that was beginning to creep into his gut. "We will enter, now or never." The group moved forward, one hesitant step at a time, until the cave entrance swallowed them whole. The darkness inside was impenetrable, the air heavy and cold, as if they were entering the heart of something ancient, something that had been forgotten by time. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the stone walls, but was soon muffled, as if the space itself was trying to swallow the sounds of their presence. There was no longer any sign of life, no wind, no distant sound of animals. There was only absolute silence, which seemed to weigh down on them like an invisible pressure dot. As they advanced, a faint light began to shine, weak and flickering, coming from somewhere ahead. As the patrol approached, the light grew brighter, revealing an immense underground hall. The walls were covered in inscriptions similar to those at the entrance, and in the center of the room stood a massive stone altar. All around him were figures carved in stone, figures that looked human, but with distorted, tortured faces, as if they were in some kind of eternal agony. The feeling of claustrophobia and terror grew with each step, but the worst was yet to come. In the center of the altar, one inscription stood out more clearly than the others, a mark that seemed to glow with a light of its own, a symbol that Ogle did not recognize, but that was somehow familiar to him. He looked at the others, doubt and fear in their eyes. Something was wrong. Something was about to awaken. "They knew we shouldn't come," GB whispered, his voice filled with terror. We unleashed something that should have remained dormant." Ogle felt a cold chill run down his spine as he stared at the symbol that glowed before him, a sense of inevitability taking over his being. They had crossed the line. They had encountered what they should not have. And now, there was no turning back. ChatGPT said. The sound of the stone moving was the first sign. A low, growing noise, as if the earth were splitting open. The altar in the center of the cavern shook, and the glow of the symbol intensified, pulsing with ever brighter light. The air grew thick, almost heavy, and a cold wind began to blow from within the walls, though there was no opening. "This is not right," Badr shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Before Ogle could react, a dark shadow rose from the center of the altar. It was not a creature, not a man. It was a being of pure darkness, its form undefined, stretching and twisting, as if made of smoke and nightmares. Its eyes glowed like fire, piercing the spirit of each one there. Ogle felt his body paralyzed, his blood frozen. He could not breathe. "Run!" Jeeb screamed, but his voice sounded distant, as if time were stretching, as if space itself were bending around them. The being moved with impossible speed, a wave of energy that tore through the hall. Ogle barely had time to dodge as a shadowy arm reached out and grabbed one of the soldiers, pulling him into the darkness. The scream was muffled, as if swallowed by an invisible mouth. "What is this? What is this?" Badr screamed, his face contorted in horror. He drew his sword, but it seemed useless against what surrounded them. Ogle did not know what to do. He looked at the others, their faces distorted with fear. The cave seemed alive, as if it were closing in on them. The ground collapsed in front of him. A hole appeared without warning, and the stones began to give way, crumbling beneath his feet. "Run now!" Ogle screamed, his voice hoarse, filled with desperation. He didn't know if they could make it, but he had to try. The group scattered, running in opposite directions, but the being followed them, its shadowy hands reaching out toward anyone who came near. Each of the soldiers was pulled into the void, disappearing into the darkness with a muffled scream. Ogle felt the weight of the secret on his shoulders. They had survived, but at a cost. The amulet, the presence in the cave, whatever it was that was stalking them, it was still with them. And he knew, with a cold certainty, that they would not escape so easily. What had been unleashed could no longer be contained. The patrol had witnessed something ancient, and it would follow them forever. As they walked back toward the safety of the forest, the shadows lengthened, and the sound of the wind seemed deeper, more echoing. Ogle looked back at the place where the dark portal had swallowed them, and one last question formed in his mind. What had they really found? He did not know. But something had changed forever, and whatever it was waiting. When Ogle finally crossed the edge of the forest, something inside him broke. The relief he should have felt at seeing the horizon open, with the clear sky and the sound of the calm winds of the steppes, was replaced by a feeling of emptiness. He looked at the others, his battle companions, but something seemed different about them too. It wasn't just their dirty faces, their torn clothes, the weariness evident in their postures. It was their gaze. These men who had once shared with him the courage and camaraderie of battle now seemed distant, as if the weight of something invisible had left them irrevocably changed. They walked, but their steps were heavier, as if they carried the burden of something beyond their bodies. The land around them seemed somehow more ordinary, simpler than before. Ogle looked at the open field, the vast fields of grass that had once made him feel imposing, part of an incomparable empire, but now the vastness seemed like a void, a hole, as if the whole world was waiting to be swallowed up by a darkness that could not be seen, but that he felt with all his flesh. He could no longer trust what his eyes saw. He could no longer distinguish reality from what was in his mind. We home? Badr asked, his voice broken, as if he doubted the question himself. His eyes were lost in something far away, something no one else could see. Everything feels wrong. Ogle didn't know what to say. What was home? Where could he feel safe after what they had seen? The feeling that something was watching them never left him. He looked at the trees in the distance, as if somewhere out there, darkness was waiting for them. But there was nothing left to do but keep going. They had escaped, not because they had won, But because the place they were in had decided to let them go, the villages around them seemed unchanged. But Ogle sensed that there was something in them that had been hidden before. When he passed by the faces of the peasants, he could swear that something in their gazes made them distant, as if they knew something he didn't, as if they had sensed the change in him, even without knowing what had happened. He sought the comfort of his home, but the familiarity he found in the wooden walls and the smell of the dying fire felt strangely alien. This was not the home he remembered. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed thicker, longer, and the nights were now endless. The wind, which had once felt like a comforting breeze, now carried a lament, a melancholy of something that should not be heard. The next day, when he met Jeeb in the village square, the man seemed even older than when they had left. His gaze was empty, as if lost in thoughts that could never be shared. "No matter where we go, no matter how hard we try to forget," Jeeb said, his voice weak, "they still follow us." Ogle felt a chill run down his spine. They spoke in low voices, but the sound of their words seemed to reverberate within him. It was as if deep in their hearts, they all knew that they had not escaped. What had been released on that altar, in that space between time and space, was now with them. No longer in the shadows of the forest, but deep in their minds. Every sound, every whisper seemed to carry a hidden meaning. At night, when the wind howled loudest, Ogle swore he could hear the whisper of distant voices, as if someone was calling to him, as if something he had left behind had not let him go. He could not sleep, and when he closed his eyes, the images of the cave, the altar, and what watched them would come flooding back. Like a nightmare that could not be shaken off, he no longer knew what was real. Badr's words echoed in his mind. "Something is waiting. They know our names." As the days passed, Ogle realized that the world around him was beginning to disintegrate, not physically, but in his mind. The people around him became shadows, distant, unreal. He saw their faces, but he saw them in a way he could no longer understand. The streets, the houses, the sky, everything now seemed a fabrication of deception, a disguised makeup that was beginning to crack. Ogle looked out at the horizon one last time, feeling the weight of what he now carried. The secret of the altar, of those things, of what he had freed himself from, was inside him. He could no longer escape, could no longer hide. He knew that what he had discovered was not just an ancient secret, it was a curse, one that now belonged to all those with him, and perhaps even the entire land. There were no answers anymore, only the echo of an undefined future, and the fear that eventually the darkness would overtake them. And so, Ogle understood, with a lump in his throat, that the real hell was not this nightmare place, but the endless journey that was beginning now in his mind, and that would have no end. Ogle returned to his routine, but the pieces of the world around him no longer fit together. He woke in the morning, the weak rays of the sun filtering through the window, and he could still feel the weight of the darkness, as if it were inside his own skin. Nothing seemed harmless anymore. The casual conversations with the villagers, the sound of water running in the streams, the gentle wind in the hills, all of it had become distorted, like a cracked painting that crumbled at the touch. He resumed his daily tasks. He worked the land, repaired what needed fixing, fulfilled the duties that had previously been a form of distraction, a simple relief. But deep down, Ogle knew that nothing he did really mattered. What he had learned, or rather, what had been forced upon him, had changed him. There was no longer any certainty, no longer any simple answer to anything. In his bag, he still carried the amulet. He didn't know why he hadn't destroyed it or buried it. Perhaps a part of him knew that. This small black object, covered in strange symbols, contained something more, something far beyond his comprehension. He touched it every now and then, feeling its cold, rough surface, the symbolic weight building in his mind. This wasn't just an object. It was a marker, something that had been meant to be found by him and him alone. A key, but to what? Something he couldn't forget, but also didn't know how to unlock. The amulet wasn't just in his bag. It was inside his soul, like a curse that silently tormented him. At night, when he closed his eyes, he could see the shadows that haunted him, or the echoes of those distant voices that called to him from the forest. No matter where he was, no matter how hard he tried to bury himself in the daily grind or the small tasks of everyday life, he knew something had broken. The curse hadn't ended when he left the cave. It had merely disguised itself, blended into the fabric of his existence. Sometimes he tried to convince himself that he was okay. He would look at the familiar faces, the simple conversations, and the laughter of children at play, and strained to see what had once seemed so clear. But he knew that these things were beginning to disintegrate, like dreams at dawn. He saw the fear in his own eyes as he stared at his reflection in the water. Something had changed permanently. And then the whispers began. They weren't voices, not explicitly. But somehow he felt that the earth, the wind, even the rocks beneath his feet were speaking to him. At first it seemed like paranoia. But soon it became a constant. The villagers, his neighbors, the children, they all seemed ignorant, unaware of what he knew. And it bothered him. They didn't know, but he did. And it separated him from everything he had ever known before. Life around him seemed more and more like a farce, a curtain that was closing as he watched helplessly. One night, as he walked through the village, looking at the simple houses and the smoke rising from the hearths, Ogle saw something. Or maybe it was someone. A hooded figure, moving with a disconcerting familiarity. The person moved quickly away, and for an instant, Ogle felt a shiver run down his spine. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it was following him. And for a moment, he had a feeling that he was no longer alone. But nothing else happened. The figure disappeared like a shadow. When Ogle asked the others, no one seemed to know anything. But the look in Jeeb's eyes, who met his that very night, said more than words could. Jeeb was quiet, somber, as if he too knew that what had been discovered in that cave could not be undone. His eyes, once full of life, were now dull, carrying an invisible weight. You still don't understand, do you? Jeeb said, her voice so low that Ogle could barely hear her. What we saw cannot be erased. What we released is with us now, no matter where we go, no matter what we try to do. Ogle had not known how to respond. He wanted to deny it, wanted to scream that this was all just a nightmare, but he knew Jeeb was right. Whatever had been released, it was not just a force of darkness. It was part of him now, a mark that could not be erased. He knew, deep down, that no elixir, no search for answers, could heal what was inside him. Life went on, like an unfinished play, and Ogle found himself trying to find some way to fit into it. But each day, more questions arose. The amulet, now kept in a locked chest, was like a constant memory, a reminder that he carried something with him that could not be purged. He looked to the horizon and knew that something else was yet to come. The secret he now possessed, or the curse, was beyond anything that could be understood by his mind. And so time passed, but Ogle felt that his story was far from over. Each step, each moment of apparent peace was just the surface. Something else moved, unseen, beneath the earth, in the shadows of the forest. He felt it, and he knew that, sooner or later, he would have to face it again. He carried the truth now, but it was a truth that destroyed him, consumed him. And he still didn't know if he could survive it.